Today I'm going to present the project, the path-through from inflation perceptions to inflation expectations. This is joint work with Stephanie Huber from University of Amsterdam and Tobias Schmidt from Deutsche Bundesbank. As Tobias is from the Bundesbank, the usual disclaimer applies. So this is an ongoing research, so we would be very happy to hear your comments, questions, and feedback. So the motivation for our project comes from two directions. The first is the survey data. Here you see in blue the mean inflation expectations and in orange mean inflation perceptions. But first of all, let's agree on the terms. What I understand by inflation perceptions. That's the answer to the survey question, what do you think the inflation rate over the past 12 months was? So this is what people perceive the current inflation is. And expectations is their forecast for the next 12 months. So here you see that these two lines move very closely together. So, and if we add the CPI, which is now in red, especially in low inflation environment, which was, so this is German data, which in Germany was until the end of 2021. So these two were moving more closely together than they both did with CPI inflation. Now it's no longer the case, but for the low inflation environment, it was the case. But the thing is, they move very closely together, and this is true not only in the Bundesbank data, but everywhere in surveys in general. The second direction of our motivation is the importance of inflation expectations. So they have been shown to influence consumer spending. They, even in the low inflation period, they were important in policy discussions because of the management of inflation expectations. But now, when inflation started to get really high and volatile, the anchoring of inflation expectations have come to the forefront of policy discussions again. So the broad question that we ask in this paper is, how do inflation perceptions relate to inflation expectations? I will very briefly say about the literature that mostly the literature either focuses on solely expectations, the biases in them, that people are wrong, that there are socioeconomic differences, especially between females and males, etc. And the same, there is a much smaller, but there is a strand of literature on the perceptions, but not so much about the link between the two. So there are some papers that state that the correlation is very high, but they don't go further than that. So we want to contribute here to look in detail into this link. So in particular, we are interested in, do perceptions causally drive short-term expectations? And whether perceptions influence long-term expectations as well. Then we want to understand how households form inflation perceptions. If they are very important for expectations, then it's a natural question to ask what goes into inflation perceptions of people. So then we want to find the factors that drive this link between perceptions and expectations. And finally, what about the policy? What are the implications? A quick preview of the results. So first we find that households' inflation perceptions, they causally drive their expectations. So we first do various OLS estimations, panel regressions, and there we cannot make causal claims, but we conduct an RCT information provision experiment in this survey, and there we are able to establish the causal link. Also, what is important for policy is that perceptions matter for long-term expectations as well. So there is a question for anchoring of long-term expectations because perceptions feed into them as well. Then we find that the most salient and frequently bought items like food and fuel are very important for perceptions, but also the uncertainty, especially during the war, influences heavily inflation perceptions of people. Then we found that different socioeconomic groups rely to a different extent on their perceptions when they form expectations. So there is socioeconomic heterogeneity. And also this link is different between low and high inflation periods. Finally, we found one factor that is important for the strength of the link between perceptions and expectations, and this is the level of uncertainty. So first, let's talk about the data. We used the Bundesbank online panel of households. This is a monthly survey. There are more than 2,500 individuals participating every month. There is a large cross-section, but there is also substantial panel dimension. So we can also run panel regressions and control for individual fixed effects. The survey started in April 2019. There are 3 waves in 2019. And from April 2020, this is an ongoing monthly survey. Regarding inflation perceptions, there is one question which we are going to use. This is a quantitative question. It asks, what do you think the rate of inflation or deflation in Germany was over the past 12 months? This is what we are using as inflation perceptions. And there are a bunch of questions on inflation expectations. There is a qualitative question where the answers range from decreased a lot to increased a lot, which we are not going to use in this project. There is a quantitative, which is like the main question that we are going to use. It asks, what do you think the rate of inflation or deflation will be over the next 12 months? And also there is a probabilistic question. So it asks, it gives, I can now show you how so this is how this question looks like. It gives the bins of potential inflation or deflation, and people have to assign probabilities. So this is a very important question to ask, because from this we obtain the subjective probability distribution, and we can obtain the mean, the median, and what is very important, the standard deviation or variance, which we are going to use as the uncertainty about future inflation. So this is what we are going to understand under uncertainty. So our first question, how are perceptions and expectations related? So first we run a bunch of OLS regressions in cross-section. So we run the regression of expectations of a household on the perceptions of this household, and with a bunch of socioeconomic controls like gender, age squared, education, employment status, income, region of Germany. And we also control for the survey wave fixed effects. So, and this is the first 4 columns of this table present the results of the OLS regressions. The fullest specification is column 4. Everywhere we see that the link is extremely strong and robust. The changes in perceptions transmit almost one-to-one into the changes in expectations. Also, we can, because there is a substantial panel dimension, we can control for individual fixed effects and run panel regressions. And also the last column is like the change of expectations of an individual I on his or her own change in perception. So it's like a change on change regression. So these 3, 5, 6, and 7, the columns are the closest to causal statement that we can get so far. So the conclusion from this is that perceptions are extremely important. They have a positive, large, and significant effect on households' perceptions. If we plot the regression coefficient by wave, then we can see, so here there are 33 waves of the survey. It is high at all times, but it is much higher in low inflation environments. So this is the first roughly half of the waves. Now, when inflation started to become more high and volatile, the reliance on perceptions decreased. So this is what we are going to test more formally. So here we split the sample into before July 2021, we call it low inflation environment, and after July 2021, we call it a high inflation environment. We run the sample splits, but also we control by introducing the interaction term between perceptions and high inflation dummy. So this is the column 5, and here we see that the link between expectations and perceptions decreases a lot during high inflation periods. So this is very much in line with rational inattention type of theories, where in times of stable and low inflation, there is no incentive to search for correct information, and inflation is not in the news anywhere. So people rely on their consumer baskets because that's the free source of information that they have. But in the high inflation environment, first, inflation is in the news everywhere, and also it makes more sense, it's more valuable to obtain correct and accurate information about the actual inflation. So Now the question is whether perceptions matter for long-term expectations as well. We have two questions regarding the long-term expectations over the next 5 years and over the next 10 years. So here you see how they look like. The medians are in dashed lines and the solid lines are means. So they were pretty stable, but starting from the war, they increased quite a lot, both 5 and 10 year ahead expectations. So both medians and means. So what we did, we ran the regression of long-term expectations on perceptions and also controlled for short-term expectations. Even when we control for short-term expectations, perceptions still matter. So the changes in perceptions, they also matter for long-term inflation expectations. So this kind of raises a question of how well anchored the long-term expectations of German consumers are. So inflation perceptions also matter for long-term expectations. Now, all that we did was correlational evidence. We wanted to obtain a causal link. So the idea is to induce an exogenous variation in perceptions and see how much it will transmit into people's expectations. We implemented this in August wave 2022. We allocated people into 4 groups. 1 control, they received no information. And groups 2 to 4, they were treatment groups. They received different information about the official rate of inflation. And also they received a reminder about their perception of inflation. Now a bit more about the timeline. So first we elicited pre-treatment quantitative perceptions and expectations, standard questions that I showed you before. Then we did information provision to these 4 groups. And then we elicited post-treatment perceptions and expectations, but in slightly different form, because we cannot ask the same question that we asked before. People are going to be anchored on their answers before to be consistent. So our information treatments. The first treatment, we provided them the CPI inflation in the previous months, which is 7.5. The second treatment, so here we provided the harmonized CPI, which was slightly higher, 8.5 at that time. And because we provide people with CPI inflation, we cannot ask them their perceptions, because we ask, what do you think the rate of inflation over the past 12 months was? And we provide them this information. So we made this assumption that people adjust their perceptions to the provided information. And naturally, for part of the people, our treatments are going to be good news if they have higher inflation perceptions before. But for some people who thought that inflation was lower, this was a bad news. And the third treatment, there we provided the people with inflation, excluding energy and food, which was much lower than the 2 numbers shown before. So it's 3.2. And in this group, we also asked post-treatment inflation perception, because we didn't provide inflation directly. So how did we ask post-treatment expectations and perceptions? We cannot ask the same question because of the survey fatigue, and also people want to be consistent. We asked the standard min-max question, which is typically used in this type of RCT experiments. So we ask what are the minimum and maximum values on inflation you expect, so like the lower bound and the upper bound, and then we ask for the probability that inflation will be higher than the midpoint of the interval. If we make an assumption of a triangular distribution, which is usually made, then we can obtain mean, median, and also the uncertainty. So here the first result, here we split the sample into people with perceptions, prior perceptions, which were higher than 8.5. For them, all the treatments were good news. And for people for whose perceptions were less than 4, likely all of the treatments were bad news. So in here we see that in the good news group, the expectations and perceptions all adjusted in the right direction. So they adjusted the perceptions and expectations downwards. And the opposite is true for people for whom the information was bad news. How do we want to use this RCT to make a causal claim? So we run the regression of the change in expectations post and pre-treatment on the perceptions, the difference between post and pre-treatment, and controlling for various socioeconomic characteristics. And this is the result that we obtain. So the first column is all the pooled groups, and then all the treatment groups. And here we see, although the coefficient is lower than it was before, still there is a substantial, sizable, significant effect, which we can now say that it's a causal effect of perceptions on expectations. Now that we know that perceptions are important, it's also a natural question to ask what goes into formation of people's perceptions. We, in April wave 2022, we asked people what are we'll give a list of factors, and we ask people to rate the importance of these factors. And here you see the results. This is the share of people reporting the factor to be very important in their inflation perceptions. And here, first of all, the frequently bought items and the most salient items like food and fuel are on top, and also the war in Ukraine, which is also partly correlated with food and fuel prices, but also with the significant uncertainty. So these were the top three factors that were the most important for the formation of people's perceptions. Now we wanted to ask if this link is the same for everybody, or some people rely more on their perceptions and some others less. We did sample split regressions and also included interaction terms, and we find that there is substantial heterogeneity. The link is stronger for women, for residents of East Germany, for employed, for low educated, for younger than 60. So we see that there is heterogeneity, and also we saw the heterogeneity between high and low inflation environments, and this can give us hints about what might be behind this. We wanted to look at two potential factors that might drive these differences. First, information sources. So different socioeconomic groups might have different information. They might be informed to a different extent. And also different levels of uncertainty about inflation dynamics might be important in that. So first, about information. We asked two questions in July 2021. So this was the month when inflation started to increase, but not crazy high like in the beginning of 2022. So first question proxied the degree of informedness that people have. So it asked, aside from the survey, have you heard or read anything about inflation over the past 4 weeks? And here the split is almost half-half. Half have heard or read something about inflation. But when we ask, what do you base your perceptions on, something you have heard or read, or your own shopping experience, then it's almost 90%. Although they have heard or read something, they rely solely on their own shopping experience. So, which also correlates with the finding that for perceptions, the food and fuel were extremely important. Next, we wanted to see if information matters only for perceptions, for expectations, or for the link between the two. Here, when we run the regression of expectations on perceptions and also for the information variables, when we include perceptions, information variables stop being significant. So they matter for perceptions, and through perceptions, they affect expectations. There is no direct effect. So here it is worth noting that it's only one wave. This is low inflation environment. We already re-elicited this question in November wave, but we don't have the data yet. So later we are going to be able to say something about how it changes between high and low inflation environments and whether this is the robust finding or not. But for now, we can say that both information variables have effect on perceptions, and through perceptions, they affect expectations. The second potential factor that might be important is uncertainty. Uncertainty, here you see the standard deviation from the probabilistic question that I showed you before. In blue, this is mean, in orange, the median. And so we are going to use it as a proxy of uncertainty. So first of all, there is socioeconomic heterogeneity in uncertainty. Here you see it based on income. The lowest income group, which is in blue, it has substantially higher uncertainty throughout the whole period. And the same is true for women, for low educated, for residents of East Germany, and for the younger. And here we can see a significant overlap between these groups and the groups that relied more on their perceptions when they formed expectations. So first we split the sample into the quartiles of uncertainty, the bottom quartile to medium quartiles and top quartile. And then first of all, we run the regressions based on sample splits. And here you see that for the lowest and the highest uncertainty, the link between perceptions and expectations is higher than for the intermediate. When we include the uncertainty squared and the interaction terms with uncertainty and uncertainty squared, then everything is significant and the coefficients on the interaction terms are of different signs. So we can say that there is a nonlinear effect on the pass-through. So people with the lowest and the highest uncertainty, they rely more on their perceptions, while in the intermediate region, this reliance drops. So the uncertainty matters for the pass-through, and it matters in a nonlinear way. To conclude, we find that inflation expectations are very much reliant on inflation perceptions of people. Inflation perceptions matter not only for short-term, but also for long-term. Excuse me. In the information provision experiment, we were able to show that perceptions causally drive inflation expectations. The most important factors for perceptions are people's consumer baskets, and particularly the most salient and frequently bought items like food and fuel. And we find that the pass-through strength varies by low and high uncertainty, and also by the low versus high inflation environment. And what are the takeaways and policy implications? If inflation expectations are to a large degree pure extrapolation from their perceptions, how can we manage expectations? Maybe we can correct the wrong perceptions that people have, because perceptions are very much away from what real CPI is. Even if we control for differences in the consumer baskets, people still are very wrong. So can we manage inflation perceptions of people? Can we try to correct this wrong information that they have? Our RCT provision experiment says yes, because that's what we did. We provide them with current inflation information, and both perceptions and expectations moved in the required direction. But in reality, households might be harder to reach. And also regarding the current situation, now, especially when the food and fuel prices are very high and volatile, and these are the factors that are most important for people's perceptions and thus expectations, there is a risk of the anchoring. Sorry.
Questions?
Is it okay, Daria?
Yeah.
Great. I have two questions. The main one, you actually rely on one-sided causality from inflation perceptions to inflation expectations. Are there any grounds from your perspective to think about more complicated causality that can also at the same time turn from inflation expectations to inflation perceptions? can you think in this direction? And the second one, I think it is more simple in terms of policy perspective. Would it be fair enough to interpret your conclusions that the problem is not inflation perception themselves, but so-called wrong inflation perceptions, as you told, and we should think in from a perspective of manipulated inflation expectations, we should think and focus on matching inflation perceptions to the actual level of inflation. Will be this fair interpretation or not?
Sorry. I tried very hard not to cough during the presentation, but I didn't manage to. Okay, first question about the reverse causality. I'm aware of only the one paper that shows that there is such a link, and this was not a very robust finding. It was, the logic was something like a self-confirming bias, but it was not shown in many other papers. Technically, we can test it because, for example, the war, it presents a shock to inflation expectations, but not to inflation perceptions, because it hasn't appeared in the prices yet, for instance, in February, but it's already a shock to expectations. So if we, So if we compare people before the war and just after the war, then just after the war survey, they have already this shock included, and we can test how much the effect on perceptions is. But we didn't do this. We focused only on this direction, and that's what we're aiming in our RCT, but that's a valid point. And can you repeat the second one?
Policy interpretation of your conclusions. Would it be fair to say, based on your conclusions, that from policy perspective, we should focus on the deviation of inflation perception from actual inflation rate? And this should be a target for policy communications.
Yeah, I think that's our conclusion. In RCT, we showed that that's possible. Like, well, first of all, in our project, in this data, we are not able to obtain the real CPI that people face. We have the share that people spend on different goods, categories of goods and services, but the CPI, the just overall CPI, doesn't convey all the information. So different, especially low-income groups, they have been shown to face substantially high inflation. So we definitely have to correct for that. So if we provide people with just this number of inflation, then probably it will be an underestimation for some groups of people. But also, there is such a large variety, like dispersion of perceptions. It goes from like -30 to 100. So potentially the least financially literate and the least educated people that have like these crazy high expectations, they can be brought to a more reasonable inflation perception. So yeah, I think that's a question worth studying, but it's not something we can conclude, but that there is a nudge in this direction. So if perceptions are wrong, then maybe it's worth spending some effort, not doing like the forward guidance, but also to inform people on the actual inflation and maybe on the composition of consumer basket, how it's computed, because people over-rely on the most frequently and salient items.
I have very general question from presentation, also not in the area. So isn't that kind of strange time and country to study inflation expectation? Because just a couple of years ago, inflation, I believe, in Germany was about 1-2%, and it was flat expectation, so they always were right. And now we're looking at the time when inflation is relatively high and uncertainty is much higher. So kind of isn't the last couple of years, isn't it a very special experiment because it's in Germany and because it's a volatile time?
Okay, so maybe Germany is special, but in the first half, the CPI inflation, you can see it in red, it was very low, and still perceptions and expectations were very high. Like, well, they were much higher than, so people were wrong in their perceptions, and also,
They all went up.
yes.
Not just in Germany.
Yes, that's a general finding in the Michigan survey, in the New York survey. Yes, so here in this respect, Germany is not very special. Maybe it has more trust in central bank. Well, it in some surveys it shows that Germany has a bit more, but it's not something very very strange. And yeah, because here we see that expectations and perceptions move very closely together, even when they are very far from CPI inflation. So there is something that drives them both, and I think this is not a German phenomenon. This is a general finding, general how people perceive and form inflation expectations.
As a non-economist, maybe I have a very naive question. In finance, we have lots of surveys data, but the targets are actually not consumers, but the professionals, the industry, businesses, and everything. So I'm just wondering if consumers are always household wrong. Is there data on business expectations of inflation, and maybe it will be much more? Do you have evidence on that?
We don't in this project. There is a Bundesbank survey of firms, and there is also survey of financial professionals. And in general, the findings for firms are that they are somewhere below, between the consumers and financial professionals. There is less disagreement, and they are closer to actual inflation, but still they are wrong. They are uninformed and inattentive. So yes, it's not that crazy as for the consumers. Sometimes it's very far off, but firms also get it not very right. But we don't have usually the data on perceptions of firms. There is data on firm expectations, but not what firms, in some surveys there is, yeah, but not in all. For instance, in Bundesbank, they ask only like 2 times. So in general, they are much more interested in their expectations.
Okay, and well, maybe the last question from me. Do you know who are these 11% of people who do not have information from their own shopping experience? And do you actually ask people whether they do the shopping or it's someone else in their household? Do you have data on this?
Yeah, so we have data about this, but this is a very small group. So I don't think a lot of conclusions can be made from it. But we didn't look in very much detail because we are going to analyze it with the November wave. There will be a larger sample, and then we can say something. And there is information about who is the main shopper, but I think it's not in all waves, and we didn't use it in the experiment. But yeah, I think at one point I also tried to look whether they have the main shoppers have a high link between perceptions and expectations, but it's not in the project. It was just one result that we once looked at. But there is such information. We can probably utilize it more.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Daria. I also wanted to ask you just a technical question, like from your results. You consider like low, high inflation environment, and then you consider different quartiles of distribution of uncertainty. So why in one instance you test the results by using interaction, and in the second you just split the sample, because you cannot directly compare these coefficients when you split the sample? When we talk about uncertainty, and how do you measure uncertainty actually, where the data comes from?
So uncertainty we measure from the probabilistic question. 1 second. So that this is this question, and from this is the variance. we have the subjective probability distribution, and we compute the mean, median, and the variance. Regarding the differences between the two, so in high and low inflation, it was logical for us to split it kind of into two periods, like to make a dummy, but also I include we test the interaction terms, and we do the same with uncertainty. But I just presented the sample splits because it's kind of, you can already see in sample splits that it drops. And it is confirmed by adding the interaction terms as well. So we have it in the paper, but not here, because it's much more evident in the split sample, the results of this nonlinear relationship.
Would you expect actually the results to differ in the environments where, for example, governments do not use inflation targeting as a monetary policy? I think it can go in various directions. I know one paper that compared the Argentina and high inflation environment and US and low inflation environment, but to be honest, I can't remember where the link between perceptions and expectations was higher. So yeah, but they tested it kind of the Bayesian updating and where the priors are stronger and where they're weaker. But to be honest, I cannot speculate where. It would be interesting to see it in some high inflation and volatile inflation country. But the trust, and then also there might be problems with the correctness of CPI data and everything. So it would be a bit difficult to test.
Okay, so no more questions. Let's give an applause to Daria.